Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Core studio. Welcome to the show. Recently, I did a Golden Pig of Strixhaven episode where I talked about my favorite commanders from Strixhaven / C21. And there was some slight confusion from some in the comments expecting me to just pick the most powerful commanders and put them all in this list. That list was based off of my favorite commander designs, and that's not necessarily what the most powerful ones are. Just as my picks for the Golden Toilet of Strixhaven aren't based off of the weakest commanders from the set, but from the ones that I dislike the most in their design. Or if you've seen that episode, you know maybe just a specific design flaw, like, 5 words just tacked onto the end of the card that completely ruins the card. Saltiness aside though, because people were asking about the most powerful commanders from the set, I decided to make this episode. So on today's episode, I'm going to be going through my picks for the most powerful Strixhaven commanders. Or I should say Strixhaven / C21 commander decks that came in Strixhaven. I'm just going to be including them all. There are 42 commanders in total, and each of them are going to be placed in 1 of 5 tiers. We're going to start with the lowest tier at D, work up to C, then B, then A, and the top tier, which is S. A quick disclaimer before we get started. The power level tier that each of these commanders are placed in is 100% based off of my own opinion. So your opinion on certain commanders' power levels might differ, and that's okay. And because they're based off of my opinions and I'm a casual player, a CEDH list might be different. If a commander is incredibly effective with some 2-card combo or with something like land destruction that doesn't see a lot of play in casual, then it's probably not going to make it to the top. Also, these rankings were made in the vacuum of just Strixhaven and C21, meaning that an S from this set might not be an S compared to, say, something in Modern Horizons 2. So essentially these power rankings are the commanders in comparison to each other. And one more thing really quick, a huge thank you to Eddie for the great discussions around these cards. But with all that said, let's jump into it. So let's start things off with the lowest tier, which is D tier. And just a quick note that the commanders within each of these tiers are not in any particular order. So within each tier, just because I talk about one commander before or after another one doesn't mean that it's weaker or more powerful than the other one. That being said, the first commander that I want to bring up is an MDFC commander with Kian / Imbraham. Kian, Dean of Substance, can tap to exile the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you put it in your hand, otherwise put a study counter on it. And then by paying 4 and a green, you get a fractal token, and then you put a +1 counter on it for each different mana value among non-land cards you own in exile with study counters on them. And on the other side is Imbraham, which has pay X blue tap, exile the top X cards of your library, and put a study counter on each of them. Then you may put a card you own in exile with a study counter on it into your hand. So essentially, these two can work together to exile cards and get study counters on them, and then you get benefits from that. Or at least I should say that's how they do work in a format like Standard, but unfortunately they don't work very well in Commander. With pretty much all these Deans, trying to get both sides to work together is incredibly clunky. You need to have a lot of workarounds to actually get to the other side of the card when you need it. And because of this clunkiness, you really can't rely on each side, so you pretty much have to pick one to focus on. And each one on its own is really weak. Now, if I had to pick one to build around, I'd probably pick Kian, but regardless of which one you pick, they're going to be in the D tier. Next up, another clunky Dean with Plarg, Dean of Chaos, and Augusta, Dean of Order. Plarg has tap, discard a card, draw a card, pay 4 and a red, tap, reveal cards to the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary, non-land card with mana value 3 or less. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost, but all revealed cards not cast this way on the bottom of your library in a random order. And then Augusta, Dean of Order, says other tapped creatures you control get +1/+0, and other untapped creatures you control get +0/+1. Whenever you attack, untap each creature you control, then tap any number of creatures you control. Again, because of the clunkiness of these Deans in Commander, you pretty much have to pick one. Augusta is either a combat-centric or tap-untap focused deck, and that's not really going to be all that powerful. And then Plarg is really only effective for a kind of janky deck where you're looking to cast one specific thing from your library. And because you're limited to a non-legendary, non-land card with mana value 3 or less and you're in Boros, that's probably going to be pretty weak. I mean, I did do an episode where you cast Restore Balance with it, but that's not really all that commander friendly for a lot of groups. So between the two, I probably would still pick Plarg to build around, but both of them are going to be in the D tier in my opinion. Next up, we've got another kind of MDFC commander with Black's Vexing Pest. It says other pests, bats, insects, snakes, and spiders you control get +1/+1, and when it dies, you gain 4 life. The backside says look at the top 5 cards of your library, you may put any number of them into your hand and the rest in your graveyard, you lose 3 life for each card put in your hand this way. So essentially if you're building around blacks, you're probably just building some sort of a tribal deck around one of those tribes. And those tribes aren't exactly the most powerful ones out there, and it's really not all that good of an effect, it's just a simple anthem, so yeah, blacks is not all that powerful. Yes, you've got access to a draw spell on the back, but when you cast it again, you're adding commander attacks to each of them. So for a pretty weak and underwhelming tribal commander, blacks, my apologies, but you are in the D tier. And yes, I know you can build a deck around Relentless Rats or Rat Colony. Those are things. Still D tier. But next up, let's move on to Fane the Broker. Fane has tap, sacrifice a creature, put 2++1 counters on target creature. Tap, remove a counter from a creature you control, create a treasure token. Tap, sacrifice an artifact, create a 2/1 white and black inkling creature token with flying. And pay 3 and a black, untap Fane the Broker. Now, Fane can do a lot of things, but none of them are really all that impactful. It's kind of like a trading post as a commander, but you're limited to just mono black. And yes, if you've got infinite mana, you probably can win in one way or another. But still, that's not going to be enough to get Fane out of the D tier. But still, does Fane look like Loki to you? It looks like Loki to me. Anyways, next up in the D tier, let's move on to Nils Discipline Enforcer. Nils says at the beginning of your end step, for each player, put a ++1 counter on up to 1 target creature that player controls. Each creature with 1 or more counters on it can't attack you or planeswalkers you control unless its controller pays X, where X is the number of counters on that creature. So this commander kind of protects you from being attacked from certain creatures, but to do so, you're going to have to grow those creatures and make them more powerful. And if Nils gets dealt with, then you've just got more powerful creatures swinging at you. Even if your friend's got a ++1 counters deck, if they just get rid of Nils, it doesn't matter. And you're in mono white. So yeah, Nils is really weak and definitely deserves to be in the D tier. Next up is another mono white commander with Mavinda, Student's Advocate. Mavinda is a 2/3 flyer that has pay 0. You may cast target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard this turn. If that spell doesn't target a creature you control, it costs 8 more to cast this way. If that spell be put in your graveyard, exile it instead, activate only once each turn. When I first saw Mavinda, my first thought for a comparable commander was Feather. Now, obviously I wasn't thinking it was anywhere near as powerful, but still there are some comparisons. But the more that you dig into Mavinda, the weaker it gets. You can kind of get extra card advantage with this, but there are quite a few restrictions with it. You basically can only cast instants and sorceries from your graveyard that can target a creature you control in extra time. Yes, technically you can cast whatever instant or sorcery that you want, but you've got to pay an extra 8 if it's not targeting a creature. And since you're in mono white, you're probably never going to have an extra 8 mana just lying around. And there really aren't that many low to the ground cantrips that target a creature in mono white. So again, the more that you dig into this, the less and less value that it really provides you in comparison to something like Feather. So at the end of the day, I really was waffling between C and D, but ended up putting Mavinda in the D tier. The final commander for the D tier, though, is one from the uncommon cycle of commanders with Rutha, Mercurial Artist. Rutha has pay 2, return her to its owner's hand, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control, you may choose new targets for the copy. So this is kind of like a pay 5 mana, copy a spell. And that's really only if she doesn't get dealt with first. Keep in mind that you can only copy your own spell, so if someone targets her with a kill spell and then you try to bounce her back to your hand, you need to cast an instant or sorcery to do so. There's just a lot of things that you really need to work around for not all that big of a payoff. So again, for all these reasons, Rutha is going to be rounding out the D tier. So now that we've finished off the D tier, it's time for us to move on to some slightly more powerful commanders in the C tier. And let's start things off with yet another Dean with Chalet/Embrose. Chalet has flying and vigilance, and tap, put a ++1 counter on each creature that entered the battlefield under your control this turn. And Embrose Dean of Shadow has tap, put a ++1 counter on another target creature, then Embrose Dean of Shadow deals 2 damage to that creature. Whenever a creature you control with a ++1 counter on it dies, draw a card. Now again, because of the clunkiness, I'm really only evaluating these individually. Sure, they can work well together, but again, there's a ton of workarounds that you'd have to do, and it'd be extremely inefficient to try to do so. And if Chalet was on its own, it would definitely be in the D tier. But because you can build an Orzhov deck around Embrose, it's going to be in the C tier. The text, whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, draw a card, definitely saved Embrose from the D tier. So with the right deck and the right setup, this can draw you a decent amount of cards. You're probably going to be building some sort of a +1/+1 counter aristocrat style build, so there are some things that you can do with it. Regardless, there are much more powerful commanders out there, so again, Embrose, you are in the C tier. In a somewhat similar way, let's talk about another one of the Deans with Valentine and Lizette. Valentine has Menace and Lifelink, and if a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. When you do, you may pay 2. If you do, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. And then Lizette, Dean of the Root, says whenever you gain life, you may pay 1. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and those creatures gain trample until end of turn. So Valentine is basically a hate bear that can exile your opponent's creatures when they die, which can be effective against specific decks. But its actual effect of being able to pay to create pests is not all that impactful. Lizette is probably the more powerful side between the two, giving you basically a way to pump your creatures whenever you gain life. So if you've got a go-wide deck with some life gain synergies, you can pump your creatures and swing out. Still, not really all that powerful of a commander, but it earned Lizette a spot in the C tier. And I promise that we're done with the Deans after this one, because this one is the last one with Uvilda/Nasari. Uvilda has tap, you may exile an instant sorcery card from your hand and put 3 hone counters on it. It gains at the beginning of your upkeep. If this card is exiled, remove a hone counter from it, and when the last hone counter is removed from this card, if it's exiled, you may cast it. It costs 4 less to cast this way. And then Nasari says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of each opponent's library. Until end of turn, you may cast spells from among those exiled cards, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. And whenever you cast a spell from exile, put a +1/+1 counter on Nasari, Dean of Expression. So Uvilda, in my opinion, is really underwhelming and might not even make it to the C tier on its own. Delayed mana reduction for specific spells that you might not need on the turn that you can cast them is not the most powerful thing. So I would probably focus on Nasari, which can give you access to up to 3 extra cards on your turn. Now I do say up to based off of a few reasons. First off, it is based off the number of opponents, so the longer the game goes, the less opponents you probably have. Secondly, it does specify that you can cast the spells, so you can't play lands. So you are definitely bound to hit dead cards off the top. And there could be turns where you hit a land off of each opponent's library and then you basically get nothing. If it was just play the cards instead of cast spells, then this might bump up another tier. But with the way that this card is, Nasari ends up in the C tier. Next up, let's talk about another MDFC commander with Myla/Luca. Myla says, whenever an opponent attacks 1 or more planeswalkers you control, put a loyalty counter on each planeswalker you control. Whenever a permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. And then Luca is a planeswalker with 5 loyalty. His +1 is you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. If a creature were discarded this way, draw 2 cards instead. His -2 is return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, exile at the beginning of your next upkeep. And -7 is you get an emblem with, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. Now between the two, the more interesting build might be around Mila, but the more powerful build might be around Luca. So going with Luca, you probably do some sort of a creature discard reanimation strategy. But since you're in Boros though, you're probably going to be heavily dependent on your commander for most of the heavy lifting. And with this commander costing 6 and you being in Boros, it's probably not going to be the most powerful things. So Mila/Luca, you ultimately ended up in the C tier. Next up, we've got Lelia the Blade Reforged. Lelia has haste, and whenever she attacks, you exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. And then whenever you exile 1 or more cards from your library and or graveyard, put a +1 counter on Lelia. So when she attacks, she does give you temporary card advantage. And she can get bigger in multiple ways. But ultimately, a mono-red Voltron Impulse Draw commander is not all that powerful. It's more powerful than, say, the D commanders in this set, but it's definitely in the C tier in my opinion. But next up, let's move on to a very different kind of commander with Ruxa Patient Professor. When Ruxa enters the battlefield or attacks, return target creature card with no abilities from your graveyard to your hand. Creatures you control with no abilities get +1/+1, and you may have creatures you control with no abilities assign their combat damage as though they weren't blocked. So Ruxa is a commander for those vanilla creatures out there that have no text. Also for vanilla tokens as well. So pumping all these creatures and helping them get damage through can be a very impactful thing. But your card pool is still decently limited. For example, running a pump effect or an anthem effect that also gives trample is actually going to hurt you. It essentially turns off any of the benefits that Ruxa gives you. So there are decently powerful things that you can do with this commander, but there are limitations, and that's what places it in the C tier. Now let's move on to a mono black commander with Tavash Gloom Summoner. Tavash has lifelink. At the beginning of your end step, if you gain life this turn, you may pay X life for X the amount of life you gain this turn. If you do, create an XX black demon creature token with flying. Basically, you can turn your life gain into a giant demon. Now, unfortunately, this commander has a decent amount of restrictions that makes it a lot worse than it could be. If you gain life during your turn, but then Tavash dies before your end step, you're not getting that demon. Also, this only happens on your turn, so you're only getting one demon on each cycle around the table. Now, if this were to trigger right away whenever you gain life, that could be a lot more impactful. A lot of smaller creatures is going to be much more powerful than just one big one, especially if that's a token creature that can simply be bounced and basically killed. So because of all this, Tavash, you have ended up in the C tier. But next up, let's move on to Lochiel, Clockwork Scholar. Lochiel has prevent all combat damage to be dealt to attacking artifact creatures you control. And whenever one or more artifact creatures enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So with this commander, you're going to have a mono-white artifact creatures build, which, yes, on its face is not the most powerful of things. Saving your attacking creatures in combat is good, and then also getting some extra card draw can be great as well, but still there are a lot of limitations with this. If this ability didn't trigger only once each turn, it could be a lot more impactful than that. So because of all these restrictions and the fact that you're stuck in mono white, Lochiel, I am sorry, but you are in the C tier. Next up, we've got one of the face commanders from the precons with Willow Dusk Essenseer. Willow Dusk has pay 1 and tap, choose a another target creature, put a number of ++1 counters on it equal to the amount of life you gained this turn or the amount of life you lost this turn, whichever is greater, activate only as a sorcery. If it wasn't for those last 5 words, activate only as a sorcery, Willow Dusk power level would be a lot higher than this. Most definitely B or even A tier. Activating only as a sorcery, though, puts a lot of limitations on this card. And in my opinion, very unnecessary limitations, so if you want to hear me talk about that, go check out the Golden Toilet episode, which Willow Dusk is on. But I won't really get into all that. All I want to say is basically this could have been a lot more powerful of a card, but yet because of the limitations of only sorcery speed, it is pretty weak. Your opponents are essentially going to be able to see what's coming all the time. So you've got to gain or lose a lot of life just on your turn, then activate this, and you can't even use it as a combat trick. So again, because of all these things, Willow Dusk, you are in the C tier. Who knew 5 simple words tacked onto the end of a card could cost you 1 or 2 tiers of power level? But next up, let's move on to Alibu Ancient Witness. Alibu Ancient Witness says, other artifact creatures you control have haste. And whenever one or more artifact creatures you control attack, Alibu Ancient Witness deals X damage to any target and you scry X for X number of tapped artifacts you control. So, like Lochiel, this commander is probably going to focus on artifact creatures attacking, which again is not the most powerful of things. Now, you do get benefits when they do by dishing out damage and scrying. Now, this does count every single artifact that you have that is tapped. If it didn't specify tapped, I think this could be a lot more impactful. Again, you can make a bunch of treasures or have a bunch of other artifacts in play that aren't tapped that could just dish out damage, but that's not the case. So Alibu Ancient Witness finds its place in the C tier. But to round out the C tier, let's talk about one of the Elder Dragons with Velomachus Lorehold. Now, this might be a somewhat controversial pick, and I went back and forth on where to place this, but ultimately ended up in C tier. Velomachus is a 5/5 with Flying, Vigilance, and Haste. When it attacks with the top 7 cards of your library, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell with mana value less than or equal to Velomachus Lorehold's power from among them without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. When I first saw this card, my immediate thought was, that's pretty powerful, you can just get a bunch of extra combat spells and just keep going over and over again like Narset. But actually, because of the way that it's worded and because of the limitations, there aren't really that many extra combat spells that work with it. In fact, I think there's really only 2. But please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Regardless, that restriction of power means that you either have to build the entire deck with instants and sorceries that are 5 or less, or you've got to find ways to increase power and hopefully hit spells that you want to hit when the power is increased. And again, this commander is a 7 mana investment to start off. So because of all these things, this Elder Dragon, Velomachus Lorehold, rounds out the C tier. But now let's find out what commanders have the power level that landed them in the B tier. First up, let's start things off with another Elder Dragon with Tanazir Quandrix. When Tanazir enters the battlefield, double the number of ++1 counters on target creature you control. And whenever it attacks, you may have the base power toughness of other creatures you control become equal to Tanazir Quandrix's base power toughness until end of turn. So this can be an effective commander in a ++1 counters build. You get a lot of creatures on the board with counters on them, you can double up one of them, and then when this attacks, you get everyone's base power to rise. On top of that, if you've got ways to pump this and make it even bigger, you can make it an even more impactful swing. Unfortunately, you are heavily dependent on that attack trigger, and this doesn't grant trample, so there are some downsides to it. And although this is an Elder Dragon, there are just more powerful commanders in this set, so Tanazir Quandrix, welcome to the B tier. Next up, we've got yet another B tier Elder Dragon with Shandrix Silverquill. Shandrix has Flying and Double Strike. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may choose 2. Each mode must target a different player. Target player creates a 2/1 white and black Inkling creature token with Flying. Target player draws a card and loses 1 life. Target player puts a +1 counter on each creature they control. Now, this commander, I will specify, is heavily dependent on power level based on how good the player playing it is in politicking. If you are not good at politicking, then this commander is probably not going to work very well for you. But if you are good at politics, this commander can really help you out. You're going to be benefiting yourself as well as one other player when you use this. So again, because this commander is heavily dependent on the politicking skills of the player, I'm placing it in the B tier. And speaking of politicking, there's Brina the Demagogue. Brina has, whenever a player attacks one of your opponents, if that opponent has more life than another of your opponents, that attacking player draws a card and you put 2/+1 counters on a creature you control. So again, like Shadrix, this commander is probably going to be pretty dependent upon your politicking skills. Now, getting a bunch of low-to-the-ground evasive creatures out can be very impactful with this kind of a commander. But still, ultimately, your success or failure is probably going to be based on politicking. So in my opinion, Brina is middle of the road when it comes to power level, so it's in the B tier. Next up, another one of the face commanders from the precons was Zephi, Thunder Conductor. Zephi has a lot of text, so here we go. Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, scry 1. If that spell's mana value is 5 or greater, create a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. If that spell's mana value is 10 or greater, Zephi Thunder Conductor deals 10 damage to an opponent chosen at random. So this is essentially a spell-slinging commander that gives you extra benefits when you're casting instant sorceries. At the very least, you're getting to scry 1, which isn't card advantage, but it is card selection. If you cast a slightly bigger spell, you get a token, and if you cast a really big spell, it's going to deal 10 damage to an opponent at random. You are generating value, but to get the most value out of this is going to be pretty tough. There are some powerful things that you can do this commander, like giving it Infect, but again, you are still kind of limited with what kind of a deck you've got to build around that. So because of all these factors, Zephi, you have landed in the B tier. But next up, let's move on to Guillaume, Master Chef. Guillaume has, at the beginning of your end step, create a number of food tokens equal to the number of non-token creatures you had enter the battlefield under your control this turn. By paying 1, you can sacrifice a food and target creature gains indestructible until end of turn, tap it. So this commander can make you a lot of food tokens, and you can make a lot of use out of those food tokens. You can protect your creatures or tap others down. Now, actually, if you don't have to pay 1 to sacrifice that food, I would probably bump Guillaume up to the next tier. Being able to protect your creatures or tap others down while being tapped down is an incredibly impactful thing. But since you probably have to keep a decent amount of mana up to make this really useful, Guillaume, you ended up in the B tier. Next up in the B tier, we've got Felissa, Fang of Silverquill. She has Flying and Mentor, and whenever a non-token creature you control dies, if it had counters on it, create X tap 2/1 black and white Inkling creature tokens with Flying, where X is the number of counters it had on it. So with this, I could see some sort of a go-wide aristocrat-style strategy where you get a lot of counters on something, you sacrifice it, and get a ton of tokens. Then you can use those tokens to either attack or sacrifice them for even more value, etc., etc. It can be powerful once you've got everything set up, but it does require a decent amount of setup to be powerful. So because of all this, that's why I placed this commander in the B tier. Next up, let's move on to another Orzhov, or should I say Silverquill commander, with Killian Ink Duelist. He has Lifelink and Menace, and spells you cast that target a creature cost 2 less to cast. Mana reduction can be a powerful thing, but again, there is that restriction that it has to target a creature. Now, keep in mind that that does include targeting your opponent's creatures as well. Mostly with this deck, though, I would focus on cantripping spells that you get reduced cost on. And I'd also focus on impactful auras as well. So to me, again, this commander is pretty middle of the road when it comes to power level, so it's squarely in the B tier. Next up, we've got another commander from the Uncommon Commander cycle with Zimone, Quandrix Prodigy. She has pay 1 and tap, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. In pay 4 and tap, draw a card. If you control 8 or more lands, draw 2 cards instead. So she can ramp you and draw you cards, which are both very powerful things in Commander. But unless you've got other cards that can untap her, you're going to be limited to just one of those things one trip around the table. So she can be powerful, but definitely not overpowered, especially when it comes to comparing to other commanders. Next up in the B tier, yet another commander from the Uncommon Commander cycle with Quintorius Field Historian. Quintorius has spirits you control get +1 with 0, and whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. Basically, get things into your graveyard, then get them out individually, and make a bunch of 4/2 spirits. It can be powerful, but not overpowered, so Quintorius, you are definitely solidly in the B tier. Next up, let's talk about Rionia Fire Dancer. Rionia says at the beginning of combat on your turn, create X tokens that are copies of another target creature you control, where X is 1 plus the number of instant sorcery spells you've cast this turn. They gain haste, X on the beginning of the next end step. Basically, cast a bunch of instants and sorceries, create a ton of copies of something that's got a powerful ETB or LTB, and have fun from there. This commander does require a decent amount of setup, and you are limited to mono red. So there are some very powerful things that you can do with that in some very powerful plays, but again, because of that setup and that limitation, Rionia, you are solidly in the B tier. And speaking of setup, let's talk about Octavia Living Thesis. Octavia is going to cost 8 less to cast if you've got 8 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard. It's got Ward 8 in Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, target creature has base power toughness 8/8 until end of turn. So yes, once you fill your graveyard with instants and sorceries, you can get this out for very cheap. And then once you get this out, it's very hard to deal with, and you can make your other creatures huge. But again, if you can't fill your graveyard quickly with those instants and sorceries, then this is going to cost 10 mana, and that's not very viable. So it can be very powerful when it hits correctly, and not very powerful when it doesn't. So Octavia Living Thesis, B tier it is. But now let's talk about the last commander to round out the B tier with Cody Vociferous Codex. Cody says you can't cast permanent spells, and by paying 4 and tapping it, you add Wooburg. When you cast your next spell this turn, exile cards to the top of your library until you exile an instant or sorcery card with lesser mana value. Until end of turn, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Put each other card exiled this way on the bottom of your library in a random order. So Cody is a very specific commander that can be impactful in the right deck. There are a lot of limitations on Cody, but if you've got just a simple Spellslinger deck that's pretty much got no permanents, it can be impactful. Or even if you have a more specific deck where you're building the entire deck around one card like the one that I built, then it can be impactful as well. Cycling a bunch of creatures then consistently casting Living End can be powerful. So with the right build, this 5-color commander can be good, but there are a lot of limitations with it, so it's placed in the B tier. So now with the middle of the road B tier wrapped up, it's time for us to move on to the second most powerful tier with the A tier. First off, there's Yadora Grave Gardener. It has whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may return to the battlefield face down under its owner's control. It's a forest land. So this is an incredibly powerful effect that essentially ramps you every single time one of your non-token creatures die. So you essentially get free ramp because green. Regardless, yes, this is an incredibly powerful effect, but you are still limited to mono green. So you're going to get a bunch of mana, cast more creatures, get more lands, get more creatures, and you see where this is going. And again, if this wasn't just mono green, it might even end up in S tier, but because it is just mono green Yadora, you are squarely in the A tier. Next up, we've got Dika Fractal Theorist. Dika has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, put X++1 counters on it where X of that spell's mana value. And by paying 3 and a blue, target creature token can't be blocked this turn. So this is a Talrand Sky Summoner-esque commander. Cast a bunch of instant sorceries, get a bunch of creatures, overwhelm the board. One difference though in the reason that I place this in the A tier instead of the B tier is that it includes copied spells. So unlike something like Talrand, you can cast a storm spell and get a lot more value out of that. I mean, just think about casting a ton of spells, then casting something like Temporal Fissure, bouncing a bunch of permanents, and then getting a lot of 5/5s on the board. And of course, there are plenty of other ways to copy spells outside of Storm. So I might be overvaluing this one just a bit, but my gut did say put this one in the A tier instead of the B tier. Another one that I was slightly on the fence about, but ultimately ended up in the A tier is Dina Soul Steeper. Dina says, whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. And by paying 1, you sacrifice another creature, and Dina Soul Steeper gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the sacrifice creature's power. Draining on gain is a very powerful thing, especially when you're draining each opponent. So if you have repeatable life gain effects, which there are plenty of, you're going to be draining your opponents very quickly. And of course, you can throw in some Aristocrat style effects like Blood Artist, and things get out of control. Though you can pay to sacrifice creatures with Dina, you're still going to want some free sacrifice outlets in this deck. Regardless, with all this taken into account, I think Dina earned her spot in the A tier. But now let's move on to Hoffrey Ghostforge. Hoffrey says, Spirit you control get ++1 and have Trample and Haste. And whenever another non-token creature you control dies, exile it. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a spirit in addition to its other types, and it has, when this creature leaves the battlefield, return the exile card to your graveyard. So essentially, when something dies, you get a bigger, angrier token copy of it. This commander can really use and abuse powerful enter the battlefield and leave the battlefield triggers. There are a lot of crazy powerful things that you can do with it, so I definitely think it found its place in the A tier. And speaking of Boros commanders, let's move on to Osgir the Reconstructor. Osgir has pay 1, sacrifice an artifact, target creature you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. And by paying X, you tap and exile an artifact card with mana value X from your graveyard, create 2 tokens that are copies of the exiled card, activate only as a sorcery. So Osgir can essentially double up an artifact for you. You sacrifice it, you exile it from your graveyard, and you get 2 copies of it. So because of this, you can essentially double up on your ramp, you can double up on card draw, there's a lot of really powerful things that you can do. It's probably one of the most powerful Boros commanders of all time, but it's still not quite one of the most powerful commanders from this set. So Osgir gets to join Hoffrey as another Boros commander in the A tier. But now let's move on to another one of the Elder Dragons with Beledros Witherbloom. Beledros has at the beginning of each upkeep create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. And pay 10 life, untap all lands you control, activate only once each turn. There's a lot going on here. First, this is a mass token producer. It makes you a token on each upkeep, so basically each time around the table, you're getting 4 pests. And again, when those creatures die, you do gain life. The more impactful thing, though, is paying 10 life to untap all lands you control. Now 10 life is a decent amount, but in these colors there are plenty of ways to gain a lot of life. Also, you are limited to only once each turn, but there are ways around that. So there are some incredibly powerful things that you can do with this, and you can have some really explosive turns. But due to this commander's high mana cost at 7, it is definitely in the A tier in my opinion. If it had a lower mana cost, it probably would make S. And speaking of that, there's Essex Fractal Bloom. Essex has the first time you would create one or more tokens during each of your turns, you may instead choose a creature other than Essex Fractal Bloom and create that many tokens that are copies of that creature. Basically, make a ton of tokens and choose the most powerful thing and get a ton of that. Or just cast Avenger of Zendikar and make a ton of Avenger of Zendikars, which make you a ton of more tokens. There are a lot of incredibly overpowered things that you can do with this commander. This is a commander that I definitely went back and forth on where to place it. But again, due to its relatively high mana cost at 6, I placed it in the A tier instead of the S tier. But now let's round out the A tier with yet another high converted mana cost, incredibly powerful commander with Jadzi Oracle of Arcavios. Jadzi has discard a card returned to its owner's hand. And Jadzi says whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a non-land card, you may cast it by paying 1 rather than paying its mana cost. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield. And the backside of the card is Journey to the Oracle. You may put any number of land cards from your hand onto the battlefield, then if you control 8 or more lands, you may discard a card. If you do, return Journey to the Oracle to its owner's hand. So yes, the backside can help you ramp to the front side. And once you get the front side out, this can easily be a one-turn win. Essentially just going from one card to the next, to the next, to the next, getting lands in play and casting things just for 1. If you cast a spell that, say, untaps all your lands, and maybe you've copied it, then yeah, things get out of control. Still, because of the high converted mana cost at 8 mana, this one made it into the A tier instead of the S tier. But again, like Essex and like Bellatrix, these were commanders that I definitely went back and forth on. That being said, all the commanders in the A tier are incredibly powerful. But now it's time for us to move on to the most powerful commanders from this set with the S tier commanders. And to start things off, let's talk about the final Elder Dragon with Galazeth Prismari. Galazeth has, when it enters the battlefield, create a treasure token, and artifacts you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color, spend this mana only to cast an instant sorcery spell. So the first commander that came to mind when I saw this was Urza. Now this commander is definitely not on Urza's power level in my opinion. But again, keep in mind that at the beginning of this episode I did say that these power levels are in a vacuum. In that again, I am comparing all these commanders from this set to each other. So I'm not taking into account that Urza is an incredibly overpowered commander that is definitely more powerful than anything from this set. So with all that said, Galazeth Prismari though is still incredibly powerful. It lets all of your artifacts, no matter what they are, tap for mana. Now that mana is limited to just instants and sorceries, but still. So now whenever you're making a ton of treasure tokens, you can utilize those permanently. It's not just temporary ramp anymore, it's permanent ramp. And there are plenty of ways to make a ton of artifact tokens out of nowhere. So whether you're making treasures or clues, etc., this can generate you an absurd amount of mana. So then you can cast some really high impact instants and sorceries, and of course you can cast instants and sorceries that untap all of your non-land permanents or all of your artifacts. So then you can make even more mana and cast even more ridiculous things, and you see where this is going. Galazeth is an incredibly powerful commander and definitely deserving of the S tier. My apologies to the other Elder Dragons, especially Bellatrix Witherbloom, who did not finish quite as high. But now let's move on to another Izzet commander with Varen, Voice of Duality. Varen has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, Varen Voice of Duality gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And if you casting or copying an instant or sorcery spell causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Doubling up your triggers is an incredibly powerful thing. In the past, we've seen somewhat similar commanders like Yarok and Teysa Karlov. Yarok is basically a Panharmonicon commander, and Teysa is basically a Death Harmonicon commander. So you could probably say that Varen is basically a Spell Harmonicon commander. And yes, I know that basically everything is a spell outside of lands, but come on, instants and sorceries are definitely more spell-like than creatures, okay? Regardless, those commanders are incredibly powerful, and so is this one. This commander is low to the ground at 3 mana and can provide you an absurd amount of value right away. You just get a couple of things out that have triggers based on whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, and then you're doubling those up by just casting small spells. So you get a bunch of cantripping spells in your deck, you cast an absurd amount of spells in one turn, you get way too much value, and you take over the game in no time. So yeah, Varen is definitely an overpowered commander, and in my opinion, definitely in the S tier as well. And speaking of overpowered, of course we've got to see a Simic commander with Adrix and Neb Twincasters. They have Ward 2, and if one or more tokens to be created under your control, twice that many of those tokens are created instead. Now, Ward 2 isn't perfect protection like Hexproof, but it is still better than nothing. It's gonna stop or prevent it from being targeted in a lot of circumstances. And the effect to double up your tokens is incredibly powerful, especially from your commander. I mean, just think about all the powerful token creators that you've got access to in Simic. And keep in mind that now when you're casting one of those clone spells like Cackling Counterpart, you're getting 2 of those tokens as well. So you get a token creator on the board, and then you make 2 copies of that, and it's gonna be game over very quickly. And just imagine what happens if you can make extra copies of this that aren't legendary. So yeah, have fun with all that math and all that overpowered value with Adrix and Nev Twincasters, which definitely fit in the S tier in my opinion. But now it's time for me to round things out with the final commander in the S tier with Exodus Awake Overlord / Awaken the Blood Avatar. Or really, I should just say Awaken the Blood Avatar. Now, Exodus definitely isn't bad on its own, and if it was on its own, it would probably finish in the A or B tier. But Awaken the Blood Avatar is absolutely ridiculous. Let's cover Exodus quickly. It has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, return target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So yeah, getting something like Gary back over and over again can be an incredibly powerful thing. There are a lot of non-legendary creatures in Mardu with very powerful ETBs or LTBs, so you can really use and abuse those. But Awaken the Blood Avatar is on a whole nother level, and I would definitely build the entire deck around this. It's a sorcery for 6 black and a red, but you're never going to be paying that amount. It says, as additional cost to cast this spell, you may sacrifice any number of creatures. This spell costs 2 less to cast for each creature sacrificed this way. Each opponent sacrifices a creature, create a 3/6 black and red avatar creature token with haste, and when this creature attacks, it deals 3 damage to each opponent. A lot of things are going on here, but basically let me sum it up. This is a sorcery in your command zone that you can consistently cast for just 2 mana. By sacrificing creatures, you can reduce that generic cost. And yes, even when you have to recast it and it's got that extra tax of 2 mana, you can reduce that as well. So basically, you build an aristocrat-style deck where you just get a ton of things on the board to sacrifice. You cast this for 2 mana, your opponents each have to sacrifice a creature, and you get a 3/6 that damages all of them when it attacks. You can also get a lot of value by threatening your opponent's creatures and then sacrificing them for this. And then again, when you cast it, they've got to sacrifice even more creatures. So you can easily keep your opponent's boards clear and just keep swinging with those creatures that damage your opponents. And of course, in aristocrat-style strategy, you're going to have other benefits from sacrificing creatures and creatures dying, so things get out of control very quickly. So to your opponents that are playing against you, good luck stopping this sorcery commander that you can just keep recasting for essentially 2 mana. It's an incredibly powerful effect that you can just keep casting for almost no mana, so yeah, you can easily take over the game with this. And with all this, thanks to the other side with Exodus, you've got access to the 3 best colors for aristocrats. So yeah, Awaken the Blood Avatar definitely earned its spot as the final commander in the S tier. And so with that, that is the final commander in these power rankings. Yeah, 42 commanders is quite a bit to go through. Regardless, I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I'd also love to hear from you on what commanders you think that I should have bumped up or bumped down in my power rankings. So let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.